Hello everyone and welcome to the online forest summit called BC Forests, the People's Convergence. Today we're going to be discussing what ownership of public land should look like and overhauling the statutory framework. And I'm here today with Herb Hammond. Welcome, Herb.
Nice to be here.
And Terence Galbania, who's the co-organizer of our summit. Welcome, Terence.
Hello, Jennifer and Herb. Thank you.
So I'm here in Grand Forks and I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Syilx, the Ktunaxa, and the Sinixt people. Karen?
I'm here in the Okanagan Valley, and that's the traditional territory of the Syilx people.
And Hammond, where are you speaking to us from?
I'm speaking from sunny Slocan Valley, which is the unceded territory of the Sinixt, the Ktunaxa, and the Okanagan.
Thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to launch into talking a little bit about Herb's background, and then we're going to go into a slideshow from Herb, and he's going to take it away, and then we'll have some questions after that. So I've had the honor of having Herb share a lot of educational information with me about forestry over the past couple of years. He's extremely knowledgeable, and many people in British Columbia know Herb. And so he's a registered professional forester and a forest ecologist with 40 years experience in research, industry, teaching, and consulting. Currently, his work is carried out through Silva Ecosystem Consultants and the Silva Forest Foundation. He's best known for his concept and application of nature-based planning, which he formerly referred to as ecosystem-based conservation planning. Herb defines nature-based planning as the protection and ecologically responsible use of ecosystems through all scales of time and space. Working primarily with Indigenous nations and other rural communities, Herb has developed more than 25 ecosystem-based conservation plans across Canada and in other parts of the world. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Forest Management from Oregon State University, and a Master's of Forestry from the University of Washington. He's the author of Seeing the Forest Among the Trees, The Case for Holistic Forest Use, and Maintaining Whole Systems on Earth's Crown, Ecosystem-Based Conservation Planning for the Boreal Forest. He's currently working with two other people on a book to be published by UBC Press on applying nature-based planning / ecosystem-based conservation planning to restore urban areas. The book's working title is Inviting Nature Home, an ecosystem-based approach to cities. He's also working on a book about nature and our place in her complex fabric. And this book describes a new reality that's necessary for our survival and how to get there in the face of the climate emergency. Extensive work. Thank you so much, Herb. And I'm going to turn it over to you. You can start your screen share now, and you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. I will see if we can get the screens happening right here. Well, I'm going to start with this photograph, a pretty scary photograph of a fire that is happening right now as we speak in the Cascade Mountains in Oregon. I've fished, fly fished in that river right where that fire tornado is in the center of it. I think unless we listen to things like I'm going to talk to you about today and other speakers in this convergence, we're headed rapidly towards that picture. So I've entitled this How We Move from Intact Forests, how we moved from or what resulted in moving from intact forests to degraded fiber farms. So we once had an amazing forest landscape, but now we're looking more and more at degraded fiber farms. So this is really a story of privatized public forests. And I hope I can give you some thoughts about how to change that story. So The timber industry's approach to sustainability looks like this picture. What's sustained here? Not much. Forestry, the way we do it, is really about forest destruction. For the past 10 years, that forest destruction has been subsidized by the public, by all of us, to the tune of $365 million a year. That's an average over the past 10 years. And I want to be clear, it was always subsidized before that too. So this is just a snapshot of the last 10 years. One of the things that we rely upon, or one of the entities we rely upon for protecting forests is government. The primary government legislation, the Forest and Range Practices Act, has an out clause in it, which simply states, as you see there, without unduly reducing the supply of timber from British Columbia's forests, we can protect water, biodiversity, wildlife, riparian areas, fishery-sensitive watersheds, community watersheds, landscapes, the whole large forest landscape, and stands. So clearly, the current structure of governance over forests is set up to put forest integrity secondary to timber. Bad choice. It's a bad choice not only because of that first image I showed you of a raging wildfire that was in part set up by the kind of forestry that we have practiced here, but it's also a bad choice because we're part of nature. We depend upon her for our lives. Nature, as having been described by E.O. Wilson, we're biophilic. We're part of the system. She's part of us, we're part of her. And we need to listen to that. We put that in a box and hide it somewhere only for the convenience of short-term moneyed interests. We also need intact primary forests. If that word primary is a little unusual to you, it simply means unmodified by industrialized human beings or only slightly modified. So natural intact primary forests. They conserve water the best. They collect and store carbon better than any other forest phase. And they have the highest level of biological diversity. And I also want to emphasize that the zenith of primary forests are old growth forests. So they're the real elders of this system. We don't know how to create primary forests, full stop. So we may know how to grow old trees if climate change doesn't get them, but we don't have a clue about how to recreate the diverse interactions, processes, and biological diversity of primary forests. But we have created a school of forestry that focuses on clear cuts. Clear cuts are lost opportunities. They contribute to global heating and the climate emergency. So simply put, clear cuts are turning forests into carbon sources instead of carbon sinks. They're turning them into degraded biodiversity instead of rich biological diversity throughout landscapes and stands. A lot of what happens from time to time as a result of fire and insects and other activities that go on in forests is salvage logging. And it's been abused by industry to, like for example, with the mountain pine beetle, all a stand had to have was 30% lodgepole pine, and it could be classified as a salvage operation applied and where people only had to pay minimum stumpage, and out of that they harvested a lot or logged a lot of other tree species than just pine. But the real kicker is that we've known for a long time that salvage logging is in many cases actually worse than logging green trees. It contributes to setting back ecological recovery on sites that are in a process of change. Forests that have burned, forests that have been killed by insects are still forests. They're simply going through another phase of development that is diverse in itself, and that diversity is necessary to rebuild the natural diversity. Logging waste gets associated with our approaches. This is a picture from an inland temperate rainforest of ancient cedar trees, thousands, definitely well over 1,000 years old, each of these trees, never having experienced stand replacing disturbances. So when we do that, we lose essential forest parts and processes. Water, biological diversity, carbon sequestration and storage. When you look at that picture of those giant cedars that will be burned or burned as much as possible on this logging site, even considering the wood that was hauled away, about 70% or more of the carbon stored there will be back in the atmosphere within 5 years. So it's definitely a big time contributor to climate change. It also is robbing us of our spiritual sustenance. We need that. That's not an option. That's something we all need. The current concept now of forest bathing depends upon that. And it's reminding us how we all feel good walking through an intact old forest. So really what we're doing is creating an ecological and social debt for the future in many different ways. Well, let's move in a direction we need to move, and that's to protect the public interest. There's a lot of ballyhoo out there from foresters and government about protecting the public interest, but the first part of when people make that claim, the first question to ask is, what's the public interest? The public interest are essential realities. Essential realities are truths, things that we're rooted in and that we know to be true, not assumptions of convenience. Truths are things like high quality water in moderate flows, air purification, carbon capture and storage or carbon sequestration and storage, high levels of biological diversity, and certainly focusing on human needs, not wants, are part of essential realities. A real important thing to think about there, needs, not wants. So if we focus on needs, then we can design economies and human societies that provide for well-being of all of us, that are inclusive of all of us, not just of a wealthy few. And that well-being will include meaningful work, or what we could call meaningful employment. So the public interest is really about survival as part of nature, not remaking nature, but survival as part of nature. So now let's look at the public interests in forests as related to by timber companies and forest professionals. The public interest there, the forest professionals and timber industry focus on government legislation and policy, not on nature, but on designing government legislation and policy to suit their needs. It simply reflects their wants of being the strongest special interest group. And make no mistake about it, they're an interest group. Similarly, make no mistake about it, they're the strongest when it comes to forests. What are some examples of that strength? Corporate lobbies, COFI, or the Council of Forest Industries, ILMA, or Interior Lumber Manufacturers Association. The BC Chief Foresters Leadership Council, for goodness sake, is all the corporate chief foresters. Really balanced, huh? Sounds balanced to me. There are no standards and no accountability. Instead, we have this Orwellian concept of professional reliance. All of this is supported by the professional association. ABCFP simply stands for Association of BC Forest Professionals. They have been essentially silent about these issues, and when they do speak up, they say, "Well, come on, government, you tell us what you want us to manage it, how you want us to manage it." So they're making that statement, while at the same time, that organization and the companies they work for and individual professional foresters are lobbying government to diminish standards and to increase timber cuts. So I leave that with you. Is this professional? Does this protect forests? So the timber company's real interest in public forests are profits in dollars. If you look at 2018, which I want to emphasize was a very good year for the timber industry, Interfor made over $111 million. Canfor over $221 million. And add Canfor pulp to that, and you've got almost another $90 million. West Fraser, $378 million. So this year doesn't look like that. If you look at their profit and loss statements, most of them have small losses, but that's been due to COVID. It's been due to the cyclical nature of housing starts, particularly in the US. But those good years definitely more than take care of poor years like we're going through. However, the public interest in the way forestry is governed in BC always has a bad year. So as that timber supply shrinks, the other irony of all of this, these companies that allege to be sustainable and here forever are busily heading south and east across the ocean. Starting in 2015, Canfor to Mississippi, 2017, West Fraser to Florida and Georgia. Now Canfor's off to Sweden and building their assets there. And both of these, the companies in the US continue to increase their US holdings. For example, 48%, almost half of West Fraser's lumber production is in the US South. So that's leaving behind a sad legacy. Over the past 20 years, more than 100 mills have closed, and timber industry has shrunk by more than 22,000 positions. If we update that 2017 figure provided by Ben Parfit, there's been an additional more than 26 mills closed and 6,000 more positions lost. We're playing a game, and the timber companies are playing a game that we cannot win because we don't have the biological productivity in our soils that the US South does. And we don't have the manufacturing facilities in place to handle the small or to produce value-added products from small wood. So we don't compete very well with places like Sweden for that reason. So to me, what the major tenure holders and major timber companies are doing right now is writing the last chapter. As long as they can squeeze low stumpage and minimal standards out of the government, they'll keep clear cutting in BC as long as they can. If we were to change the rules so that they had to actually pay what the trees were worth and constrained where they could cut significantly, most of them would just leave. But behind would stay a lot of people who are committed to a much more holistic view of forests and communities. So Forestry Today in BC is focused primarily on logging, primary and old growth forests. It's the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases, sometimes more than double the rest of it put together. That's something that more people need to stand on the rooftop and scream about. We're all fixed on electric vehicles when we are producing greenhouse gases at a much more rapid rate in how we manage forests. Wood pellets that are allegedly being created from waste. There is no waste in a forest. It's all there for a purpose. But our forest minister and many foresters have designated parts that they don't want for timber as waste. And now they're turning that into pellets to send to Europe to burn for energy, and that produce significantly more greenhouse gases than burning coal. The forestry is the major cause of loss of biodiversity. Zoonotic diseases, like we're all dealing with right now, have emerged from that situation, from that degradation of biodiversity. Will the next one come from BC because of what we're doing with forestry? It's the primary cause of water degradation, and it's a major contributor to floods and drought. So on one end, it produces too much water by the way we do it, and at the other end, things dry out too sooner. All of this for a shrinking amount of the gross domestic product. It's no longer and never was really the engine of the BC economy. So we need to change that picture, or Earth will change it for us. All we have to do is think about the fires around us if we doubt that. So I want to compare this with forestry in the Pacific Northwest. I grew up there, and so I know the system well. I practiced forestry there, and I'd be the first to say I don't think everything's perfect there by any means. But I want to give you one example that's quite an inspiring one. In about 24 years ago now, because of a little bird called the spotted owl and some legislation I'll explain to you, there was a Northwest Forest Plan put in place that protected primary and old growth forests. After 20 years, they evaluated that plan. At the start of it all, the industry said, oh, the sky's going to fall, the communities will blow up or dry up and blow away. But 20 years later, what they found was there's been increased carbon sequestration and storage, so good for reducing climate emergencies, improved water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. It protected and restored biological diversity, and look at this, healthier, more diverse community and regional economies. That's kind of interesting. So why did this happen? Why is there so much difference between that picture that I just showed you of Northwest US forests and Forestry Today in BC? Well, the first thing is public control of public forests. Because there was public control there, it enabled them to change the picture. Accountability is catalyzed by legislation, and there's good legislation there. There's an Endangered Species Act with teeth. There is a National Environmental Policy Act that requires every proposed forestry operation to undergo an environmental assessment, every one. And there's a National Forest Management Act that provides key overriding standards for planning and operations so that people can hold foresters and forest companies accountable. So that has led to cooperative problem solving, because people get tired of fighting. And if that doesn't work, though, it gives the public an opportunity to litigate or to challenge in court the decisions. And so it gave priority to protecting ecosystem services or benefits from ecosystems and established ecological reserves. That needs to be a starting point here. But curiously, I remember well when this was happening, all of this was severely opposed by the BC timber industry and forest professionals. They fought hard to prevent those three kinds of acts and that kind of plan from happening in BC. And you know how they did it? The main argument was to say, oh, we're Canadians. We're not going to be litigious like those Americans. They just want to fight with each other. We're going to work together and have good, in fact, better forest management. Well, maybe we should look at that picture 20 years later and see if that really worked. So how did we get to the problem here? It started by literally giving public forests to timber companies and providing industrial control. We call that the quote unquote forest tenure system. It's much more accurately called the timber tenure system. That has invested so much power in professional foresters and timber companies that it literally shapes how forestry is done, the legislation, policy, and regulations around forestry, education and research, employment and labor relations. So it's got a stranglehold on things. And there's a couple of key features that you need to know about. One is this euphemistically described evergreen clause. Sounds nice? Well, that means that the tenure is renewed automatically as long as the company wants it. The government is legally required to renew it. The government may cancel it for mismanagement or cause, but that's never been done for major licenses. And I can tell you that I was right at the center of one serious attempt to cancel a tree farm license for cause, working with the Nisga'a Tribal Council. But that's another story. I just want to let you know I've been deep into that issue, and it's disgusting how how much of the control and the legal rights have been passed over to timber companies. In fact, so much has been passed over that courts in many instances have referred to tenure as very close to fee simple property rights. So another key feature is the sale or transfer of tenure. Remember, these were given to the companies. Now, that gift of tenure over public forests, once that is in place, companies exchange those tenures or sell them back and forth. So they're selling public forests and timber rights as though they were their fee simple property. They're profiting from the gift of public forests, again, at our expense. Here's just from their recent 2019 annual reports, just to show you that these companies, how much they value it. West Fraser values it at $493 million. Canfor, 446 million. Interfor, 61 million. So this isn't a myth. This is happening. So, okay, has this system worked? Well, for a while, it appeared to work. It provided cheap access to old growth forests, the bounty of nature. For a few, mainly corporate owners and shareholders, and forest workers got a small share. But they've quickly figured out who was in charge, and so they were afraid to bite the hand that fed them. But these come at a major cost: ecological degradation and lost meaningful work, lost employment. Since 2000, there's been about 45,000 jobs lost, and that's growing. Well, you'd think by now, with what we've been talking about, something would change. Why does it continue? Really simple: the power of a corporate lobby, plus the ominous silence of forest professionals, professional associations, and educators. Where are these leaders in our society? Absent without leave. So how does this corporate control get propped up? Senior government managers have a timber bias. The current deputy minister was the past president of the Council of Forest Industries. That's convenient. Perverse subsidies. We could have several hours of talking about just this topic, but here are some examples. Professional reliance and no accountability, that's a subsidy. There's no standards to protect forest ecosystem benefits or non-timber forest uses, another subsidy. Lack of field-based inventories. We don't really know what the condition of the forests are out there, seriously. And that's another place I've spent decades looking at in the work and planning that I do. It's pathetic. Ecological degradation, which we can find everywhere, is not considered as a cost. It's externalized or passed off to future generations. And there's a real serious lack of easily available public information, which prevents informed debate. David Broadland has done a wonderful job recently, but through a lot of painstaking research in digging out some of that information. Timber companies effectively determine what they pay for the timber, not the market, not the government, not all of us. So there's another subsidy. You think they're going to overcharge themselves? I don't think so. And there's no local or regional or provincial log markets. The COFI's log prices are a controlled experiment in timber companies dumbing down the real value of lumber and logs in BC. When timber companies lose their timber cutting rights that we gave to them, we pay them for it. An example, in $1988, when Guayhanas, the southern part of Haida Gwaii, was declared a national park reserve to be co-managed by the Haida and the government of Canada, the timber companies were paid $100 million in 1988 for rights that had been gifted to them. And all the stuff that we do, from silviculture to restoration to wildfire resilience, that's all another subsidy. So finally, we prop it up by providing really easy access to government decision makers for corporate interests. And that is combined with virtually excluding access for non-timber interests. Any of you who've tried to get a meeting with the deputy minister or the minister of forests know about that. So we have now really solidified corporate control through timber supply area coalitions. The government sanctioned them and put industry in charge of them while telling us they were going to be take into account the needs of communities. There aren't conservation interests on these coalitions. There's not water user interests on these coalitions. This is the final stage, in my opinion, of privatizing public forests, done under an alleged social democratic government. Disgusting. So if the Dalai Lama is a pretty wise person, and I think he's giving us a real warning here that what we've been talking about to this point isn't where we want to go. And boy, like the lead-off image I showed you, it's here, folks. We better wake up and pay attention to what not only forestry, but many other of our activities are causing when it comes to climate change. So let's talk, before we talk about some details of how to change the governance, let's talk a little bit about where to go. First of all, decisions, we have a choice. We can either drive our decisions on narrow human-centered kinds of values, or we can drive them on earth-centered values, concentric values. Concentric values literally mean we're all related. And that doesn't mean just people. That means we're related to the trees, to the fungi, to the rocks. We're all kin. And if we see ourselves in that way, then we treat the system in a different way. Where does this path lead? Well, first of all, it starts with a vision for the forest. The forest, not for logs, but for the forest. Ecological integrity is the first priority. And the first priority there is to protect it and, where necessary, restore it. We don't want to be in the business of restoration. It's a long-term job and one we don't even understand very well. Conservation biologists and as well as intuitive thinkers tell us that we have to protect at least 50% of the area for ecosystem benefits. And those have to be well distributed, not just in parks, but they need to be everywhere. They need to be big areas, but there needs to be linkages and small areas that are protected as well. And nested between these areas of protection are human use areas, places where we could cut trees in the right way, do tourism in the right way, build settlements in the right way. And that means we end up with balanced human and non-human uses. A much different picture than we've been looking at through the timber tenure system. So we're really seeing forests in this way: identities to be respected, not objects to be dominated. How do we implement this vision? Well, I really want you to hear this. We have to start from our hearts. Our hearts don't lie. Our hearts are what directs our intuition. Our intuition is there for survival. No animal doesn't listen to their intuition because they want to survive. We seem to be the only one that wants to ignore that biological reality. But we're not going to solve these problems from our brains, with our brains leading. We're going to solve these problems with our hearts leading. So some key ingredients of that: we need to have nature-based plans. I'm going to talk in more detail about those in a different presentation, but they're at the core of it. We need to work with Indigenous people to develop meaningful reconciliation that brings into play these nature-based plans across landscapes. We need a holistic definition of the public interest. We need a definition of the public interest that's enshrined in law, taught in schools, and practiced on the ground by forest professionals and anyone who's involved in the forest. And that can be achieved through devolving control, culturally and socially responsible control of forests through local community forest boards that implement the nature-based plans that we start with. So that can bring a much more inclusive way of relating to forests, and it can bring people who are close to the forest into the decision-making process. Entrepreneurs, timber companies, tourism companies will have to operate within the standards of the nature-based plans that are administered by the Community Forest Board. A much different picture than we have today. So let's look at some practical pieces of that picture. The first thing, practical piece, is what I would call a Forest Conservation and Restoration Act. That would establish the key ingredients that I just mentioned, and it definitely redefines what forestry means. We have to do that. It would also establish a government, or we would also establish a government agency to provide technical and logistical support for community forest boards. So there's going to be a lot of technical stuff here, and there needs to be a publicly accountable body that would provide the backup for community forest boards so they have the information they need to act accordingly. And we need to design and implement a series of steps to move from timber tenure controlled by companies to a system of community forest boards. Part of that will be to reestablish the Ministry of Forests under a mandate of ecological integrity. Abolish professional reliance. Abolish professional reliance. You can go to bed at night with that mantra right in front of you. George Orwell would be proud of you. You can't sell you can no longer sell or transfer tenure. If you want to sell it, it reverts to the government, period. So remember, that's not going to happen for a long time, but that's an initial step. And legislation that requires nature-based planning, from large landscape level plans right down to operations with specific standards. So those will eventually be enshrined in legislation, but that also goes back to that Northwest Forest Plan, where we can see when you have good detailed standards and legislation where you can get. And a key part of nature-based plans will be shared decision-making with Indigenous nations and rural communities. Remember, forestry is not a science. I just talked about, we're going to redefine it. Forestry is a practice. It's like medicine is not a science, it's a practice. So, and we've seen how you can redefine medicine. We've done it through the years. Well, let's do it with forestry. What we have right now is an industrial definition. We need to redefine forestry so that it mitigates and adapts to climate change, protects water, biodiversity and employment, and socially responsible economics. And keep in mind what E.O. Wilson, who's a pretty good thinker, has been telling us for a long time. We have to set aside half the planet or more if we're going to survive, period. So forestry doesn't even come close to doing that. So let's look at the next practical piece here, a transition strategy to get to where we just outlined. Pass and implement appropriate legislation. That could be done in a government sitting. Phase out timber company control of forests, including timber supply. Again, they were gifted to them quickly. They need to be removed quickly. Emphasize ecological restoration and climate resilience to create near-term jobs. As I said before, we don't want to get in the business of ecological restoration, but every clear cut is a restoration job. And so in the near term, we can work on those. And we want to phase in community forest boards with regional log sort yards. That's where timber gets cut. It's no longer going to be done through a subsidized stumpage system. The logs will be taken to a regional log sort yard and sold to the highest bidder. In the Convergence, you'll hear Jim Smith talk about the experiment that they did in the Vernon Log Sort Yard, and what a great model of a regional log sort yard it was, and how much more revenue it captured for the Crown. Existing timber companies can bid on the timber, but if they aren't the highest bidder, then the highest bidder buys it. So these practical pieces and making this change always requires some money. So how do we finance it? Well, one part is a wealth tax. We need to do that, individual and corporate. And trees store carbon. So when we cut a tree, we should be paying a carbon tax in the same way that, or in a similar way that we pay a carbon tax for gasoline. Forest user fees. People that use trails, and I don't think they should be charged exorbitantly, but we're all used to paying user fees for a lot of things. We need to pay user fees according to what people can afford and what their return is from using the forest. And climate emergency funds. Boy, forests, intact, natural forests are Earth's best terrestrial carbon sink. So protecting forests is about dealing with the climate emergency. And we need to spend climate emergency funds to do that. Forests should look like this in the future. This is the Hera Proctor community forests. It's been logged. Those are full cycle trees. If we all gather there again, or gather again in 50 years, some of us will be fairly ancient by then, it will look even better than that, because those full cycle trees will be there for their entire lifetime. So let's look at, again, at a few more pieces here. Auction the logs through regional log sort yards. We've talked about that. This carbon tax on trees is a really interesting one because the carbon tax should go up as the age of the tree and or the size of the tree goes up. So we want to discourage people from taking big or old trees out of forest ecosystems. And the way to do that is to tax them. And the community forest boards are going to be a licensing body for non-timber users. Timber is not the only problem in our forests. There's a lot of ill-planned and ill-carried out recreation, in some cases, other forms of development, including housing developments and things. So that's all going to be covered under the nature-based plans that are administered by community forest boards, and they will license those uses. So this is a picture of the Hera Proctor Community Forest. Some time ago, a complex, full spectrum forest that goes from logs to finished millwork and wood products. They have created a picture that is a good model that provides a forest with diverse, fair land bases for all beings. Instead of the one job or less than a job per 1,000 cubic meters, which is about 30 truckloads of logs. Think of that, less than one job for approximately 30 truckloads of logs is what the timber industry now provides. In contrast, 5 to 7 jobs and even more can be produced by operations like Hera Proctor and other well-planned operations that are operating under nature-based plan. We can do that. If we did that, we could reduce the annual allowable cut by 80% and employ the same number of people. Boy, we probably wouldn't be having this meeting if we'd done that. So it provides a forest that furnishes the needed ecosystem benefits like air and water that we need for survival. And most importantly, it provides a forest for all beings, both us and non-human beings. We're back to the public interest as we wrap this up. There's one forest for all values, not a different forest for different values. We have to realize that. And so if we're going to do this right, the public interest or the public trust, what's held in trust for future generations, we have to give priority to the most important values. And that means a hierarchy. So ecosystem values come first, then cultural values or social values, and then economic values. I'll explain that in more detail in another presentation, but that's the core hierarchy behind nature-based planning. Forests are held as a public trust for the well-being of today and future generations. So it means that their ecological integrity is the primary concern of that trust. So the main purpose of the trust and the main purpose of the or statement for the public interest is to protect ecological integrity through precautionary decisions and actions, restore degraded forests, and avoid the need in the future for restoration. So the big roadblock to change is that tenure system. It was given to corporations by government because it was deemed to be the right social and economic decision at the time. Now's the time to take it back. Those old growth and primary forests are critical for dealing with the climate emergency. Mark Carney, who's heavily involved in economics and finance, provides this caution. Nobody's will have the luxury of ignoring climate risks. So we need to take advice from this. maybe we know a little bit more about this than the guy with the parachute there. If we reassume our responsibilities and through nature-based planning, manage for abundance, which Joe Martin so aptly talks about, think like a forest ecosystem, we can have a happy ending. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Herb. That's you summarized a lot of stuff very well, and brought out some really important points. I just have one question, and then I'll hand over the questions to Taryn. And I've heard you talk about eliminating the tenure system over a period of 2 to 3 years by paying out the forest companies, giving them a money for their tenures. So where do you stand on that issue now in regards to tenure?
We don't have time for an incremental solution, period. We don't have time for a number of reasons. The most important reason is the climate emergency. That's why I started with that picture of a fire. And we also don't have time for that because there isn't in place the legislation to allow us to have a level playing field of negotiating how to make incremental change. Timber companies will talk as long as we want to talk, and they will encourage us to say, we want to be nice, we want to get to know you, figure out how we can incorporate your values, but it's not a level playing field, either politically or legally. And so is that the tenure system has never provided the benefits that other jurisdictions, European jurisdictions, American jurisdictions have. Let's realize that we made a big mistake here and that we gave corporations a really large windfall, and then they set it up and worked really hard to make it seem as though it was irreplaceable, that we had to keep it. And by the way, I don't think we should buy them back. They have profited and written off their investments over and over again. I know that from having on a couple of different occasions working with Indigenous nations, valued the infrastructure of timber tenures, thinking that First Nations would either buy them or negotiate getting control of them to have control back of their traditional territories. We don't need to buy them, and we shouldn't buy them. We have a really, really sound social and economic rationale for that right now. One, the climate emergency is the social and biodiversity crises are the ecological rationale, and the social rationale is that we're not getting our money's worth at all out of the timber that's being extracted from these areas. So I'm not in favor of that. Incremental change in that regard, and first of all, incremental change seldom works unless you have a balanced table legally and politically. If the people sitting at the table to make incremental change have equal political and legal power, then you've got a chance for incremental change. But that seldom ever exists. And the other thing that we always have to ask about with incremental change is, do we have time? And no, we don't.
Thank you. Taryn, over to you.
Hi, Herb. Thank you. I did want to ask about the tenure system and buying it back, so you led right into that. The tenure system was put in place to make sure the forestry industry supplied us trees, supplied great jobs and healthy, vital communities, and that's not the case. Why can't we just go to government and say, look, the industry isn't fulfilling its obligations? Is there some sort of fast track way that we can show this to the people and to the government and force them to hand over the tenure?
Well, I think the evidence is quite overwhelming right now that tenure hasn't worked. And there's been some nice analyses done of that recently by David Broadland of Focus Magazine. But there's been a lot of us who have done these through the years too. And I think if you take the experience of a lot of retired foresters and some practicing foresters, people that have the experience, they can put together the numbers which already exist there really to show why tenure hasn't worked. I think, Taryn, we're back to the same problem I just mentioned to Jennifer, and that's the balance of legal and political power. I think we can assemble that information. I did that once for tree farm license number 1. Interesting that it was tree farm license number 1 for the Nisga'a. We did a report. It was peer reviewed by both other foresters and soil scientists, other people given good marks. And we turned it over to the legislature thinking that the legislature would see fit to cancel the license, and in this case, the Nisga'a wanted to assume control of it. What happened was the government laughed us off, basically. They said, oh, you guys, this was definitely a systemic racism at work, for sure. But they also said, we've got good foresters, they know what they're doing, get out of our way. We turned it over to the ombudsman. The ombudsman hired an independent forester who said that our work was very cautious, which I was glad to hear because we were trying to not, we wanted to be even stronger than we were. And the ombudsman researched it further, recommended the tree farm license be canceled and handed over to the Nisga'a. What happened there after that occurrence was that the ombudsman was fired by the legislature, and I received my first ethics charge from professional foresters for criticizing clear cutting and mismanagement of forests. So that shows you, and it's back, Jennifer, to the incremental part. Don't think, I mean, that intimidation is now much more subtle than it was then. Then it was like a sledgehammer, but it's still there, and it still works its way through that. So so we have all the information we need. I think it just takes an uprising of the citizenry. I think, and I think the more broad-based that can be, including loggers and other foresters, I think there's young foresters who would get on board with this, but they're scared for their future too. And so we need to provide safe places for people like that. Then I think legislatures would have to listen. But that's my approach to it. I definitely am opposed to paying people for things that were gifted to them that they profited immensely from.
Agreed. You mentioned something about how we all have to get on board, that government and industry is certainly not going to make the changes. People like Jennifer, people in unions, First Nations, we're going to have to make the change together. I went to a summit in Victoria, and some University of Victoria and UBC profs spoke, and one suggestion was that First Nations actually can buy back their own land, and it wasn't received very well. And I think, can we talk a little bit about the academic world and the education of the forester? In your history, when did you decide as a forester that things weren't being taught in a sustainable manner, in the best way for our forests?
Well, when I went to university, it was in the 60s. And then to show you how progressive it was, in forestry school, women were not allowed to take forestry, for one thing. So show you where people's heads were. And the other thing was groups like the Sierra Club and words like biological diversity and things like that were very new and very and the world was small c conservative, not you know, and it was kind of like there certainly were those of us who read the work of Aldo Leopold and people like that, but we were still in a time where it felt like there was so much forest out there that we couldn't mess it all up, you know. Well, we've got a much different picture today. And I think, unfortunately, that educational institutions as a generality, not as all the people in them, but as a generality, shape what they teach so people can get jobs. And for example, one of the things to become a licensed professional forester, there's a module there about the business of forestry and the economics of forestry, but not a module about the ecology of forests. And when I asked about that, the professional association told me, well, that's a really good point, but we have it structured that way because that's what the employers want. And I think that kind of attitude and approach to forestry pervades at least the administration of forestry departments in most universities, if not all. And one of the things that's very scary to me is the bioeconomy, which the bioeconomy is basically is saying we're going to cut trees to make them into fuels, into bioplastics, and we're going to, and it's fueling the idea of cutting smaller and smaller shrubs, everything. And it's very scary to me because I heard a consultant in a webinar talking about the bioeconomy, an industrial consultant say, we cut about 55 million cubic meters a year, or 58, something in that neighborhood. And we should be cutting 220 million cubic meters a year, 4 times that. And that's what the bioeconomy could offer us. Well, what is UBC supporting a lot? A bioeconomy, you know? So it's not, you don't hear UBC talking about nature-based planning. You can find individual academics that are supportive and knowledgeable of it. But as institutions, they're putting forth a much different public face. And that's the public face that the employers want them to put forth and the kind of people they want to have them graduate. So I would love to see, I mean, reforming education is high on my list. I mean, if education had a social and ecological conscience as much as it had a short-term economic conscience, we'd see a different world.
Karen, do you want to do one more question, and then I'll do a question, and then we'll wrap it up?
Sure. I'm just really glad you mentioned, Herb, that technology isn't going to save us. That's what universities and industry keep thinking. If we get better LiDAR, better photography, or bigger drones, that we'll have more trees to cut. I did just want to ask you about your restoration, how you mentioned more than once to not get trapped into the rabbit hole of restoration. Community groups like Jennifer's and mine and others all over the province, you know, we go for grants and we do our own research, our own monitoring, our own measuring, our own studies, making ourselves feel good, patting ourselves on the back, yet we'll never ever catch up to the, you know, clear cuts of the tenure system. How can we ensure a model of forestry that doesn't have such degradation, so restoration isn't needed? Would your nature-based forestry consider clear cutting at all in it? Is there a need for clear cutting at all? Especially, I'm saying in my community watershed or anywhere. Can you just discuss clear cuts?
Okay, well, what a nature-based plan has a lot of things in it, and I am going to do a little talk with Don Morrison about that, so we can get into that a little bit more detail. But the key part of it is it designs protected networks of ecosystems from large protected areas through watershed level landscapes down to individual sites. So if you were to look at a nature-based plan, you would see whole watersheds protected as for biodiversity, for blueprints of how to do restoration, how to put degraded areas back together again, for areas to provide for water primarily, and for carbon sequestration and storage. Boy, a natural one for that becomes community watersheds, doesn't it? So you have those watersheds, or big protected areas. They're connected with linkages that are intact systems. So they're not just there as an island that can start to fragment around the edges, but they're there in a connected way. And then in the watersheds in between, you have finer scale networks. And that's that second level of network we call protected landscape network in our jargon. And that still has big patches of old growth, some small watersheds that are protected for old growth, cross valley linkages, so they're linked that way. All ecologically sensitive areas become protected. Steep slopes, shallow soils, very wet sites, very dry sites, all of those become part of protected ecosystem network. And when you get done with that, you have some places of stable ecosystems that are less important for water and biodiversity than the rest of that protected network is, or I shouldn't say less important, but are covered. You've covered the biological diversity needs through those other networks. And then you go through a process with the local community of what's called human use areas. And so the local community then can decide, do those areas become timber areas? Do those areas, some of them become tourism areas? Are some of them important for settlement? Are some of them more important for local cultural reasons for protection? So out of that then pops some places that timber is where you want to focus. And there, no, you don't do clear cuts. That picture of full cycle trees that I showed you in Harrop Proctor, that every area where you log, in my opinion, should have somewhere around 25% of the large trees, well distributed by species across the site, protected as full cycle trees that grow old, become a snag, die, fall down, and enrich the processes of the forest. If you think about it, in an interior forest, a tree may live to be something in the order of 250 to 500 years old. You can get older ones for sure, but certainly those lifetimes are easy. But that's just the beginning of their lifetime and their role in the forest. They're going to stand as a snag for another 100, 150 years. And a big one will be an important part of the soil building and water filtration process for 400 or 500 years. So even an old tree, only half of its life of process in a forest is while it's still living. So we need, at that where we cut trees, to have full cycle trees. We need to protect the fallen trees because that's nature's water storage and filtration system. That's how we get pure water coming out of our watersheds and creeks that flow out of them. And they also provide really important animal habitat for a wide diversity of animals. So yeah, that's a thumbnail sketch of what a nature-based plan is, and why it's inclusive of humans and non-humans alike.
Thank you for that, Herb. So I just have one final question, and you've been doing this for a long time, and you and other scientists and ecologists have been presenting the ecological view. Sorry, excuse me for just one sec. I'm going to edit this out. Grizz. He's slurping himself very loud. I'm going to start that question over. So you have been presenting ideas for nature-based solutions for a very long time, as well as other ecologists and scientists, biologists have been presenting the government with the ecological reasons why we need to change our forestry. And they've been ignoring that. As compelling as it is to someone like me and Taryn and thousands of other people in British Columbia, that the ecological argument is ignored by the government. And I'm wondering if we go to them with an economic argument, because you've dealt with governments a lot, if we go to them and we're presenting them with the economic benefits of switching the system and changing forestry legislation, what do you think the BC government will respond to more? Will it be something like more jobs? Will it be small business creation? Will it be changes to the GDP? What kinds of economic arguments impress the government?
Well, that's a very important question and a very far-reaching question. Let me just say that I have over the 40 years of doing analyses and plans, I've done lots of economics. We gave a paper in one of the early ecological economics international conventions because people were liked our approach to economics. I've had our plans peer reviewed by neoclassical economists always who say this is leading edge economics. And so I understand economics. The problem with governments and economics and society and economics is they're not really looking at economics. They're looking at corporate financial appraisals. And they would take a little while to explain that, but the reality is that economic arguments have been presented to various governments by myself and others. The Vernon Log Sort Yard was a great example of practical economics that the government ignored, not just ignored, but they tried to manipulate numbers. I worked with Jim Smith and Tom Milne in that situation. And I know from analyzing it myself, how people were trying to move the numbers so it didn't look so good. And part of my job was to keep them honest, and we did, but it didn't ever really amount to any change. And so that gets to the point of how do you change governments? And the next thing it gets to is how do governments make decisions? Regrettably, politicians have the disease of power, and they make decisions based upon what they think will get them elected the next time, not on what's right. And I think that's got to be.
Herb, I just lost you. Can you start over? Governments think about what will get them elected next time. Start from what you said after that.
Oh, okay. So governments have the disease of power. They make decisions based upon what they think will get them elected next time. And they are constantly lobbied by corporate interests, and the corporate interests are the ones that get them elected. And look at this social democratic government, quote unquote. The history of politics is one of moving to the right, not to the left. So what we now call the left used to be the right. And so I know that's a cynical view of politics, but I challenge anyone to prove me wrong there. So I think that my approach, way more than trying to change government, is to get more and more examples of the right thing on the ground. And I think that's what's achievable, because I think communities who may have to first vote with their feet, meaning in roads and other places like that, can stop things. And when they do that, they need to have in their hip pocket the structure for a nature-based plan, ideally a nature-based plan, but they could have just the principles there to say, this is what needs to happen, and these are the people that need to share in the decision-making for how this happens. So that's, in my opinion, a more achievable way to influence government than trying to build a movement that's kind of as big and structured as government, which in my experience in trying to do that is really difficult because unions have different interests. Lots of big environmental groups have different approaches and interests. They don't want to bite the hands that feed them in terms of corporate-based foundations. A lot of things get in the way of making those things happen, but it doesn't get in the way of good on-the-ground examples. That's where what I would encourage people to think about. I don't think government's going to change this. I think people will change this by being the leaders to show them the way.
Great, thank you so much. Taryn, any last comments or question? And then we'll wrap it up.
I just want to thank Herb. That our challenge is, the challenge we face is to tell the truth of what's going on in the forest today. For people that, like us, that live in the interface, it's easy to see in our backyards, but we need to inform the other people in the province the truth of what's going on. And I just wanted to ask you one quick thing of, is forestry and industry doing anything about climate change? You've mentioned climate change as being the big factor here. What are we doing in our forests today that's, how are we treating them differently? Is industry treating them differently because of climate change? Is there anything happening?
Nothing of significance. About the only thing that foresters are doing as they continue clear cutting their way across the landscape is to plant trees that they believe will be more resilient to a warmer, drier climate. The problem with that is that they are creating environments that those trees can't even survive in a warmer, drier situation. And in many cases, they aren't even planting climate resilient trees, because if they did, the sites where they would plant them now are not really suitable for those trees. So I'm going to talk a little bit in that other presentation about climate change resilience and how you get there. But having networks like I described to you about in a nature-based plan, that also provides the biological diversity and the forest structural diversity to allow for allow for fire, allow for insects to punch holes in it, and still have living forest ecosystems that have good biological diversity and can adapt to climate change. And that keeping that kind of diversity is so critical there. And gosh, foresters are doing the exact opposite. They're taking heterogeneous, diverse systems and homogenizing them with clear cuts and tree plantations. Bad choice.
Thank you so much, Herb, for covering so much ground in a short period of time. Thank you so much, Taryn, for those great questions. We're looking forward to your other presentation, along with Dawn, talking about nature-based planning and how to live with nature, even as we use the forests. So, all right, I'm going to sign off right now. Thank you so much, and have a great afternoon.
You're welcome.
Bye, Herb.
Bye
Bye,
now.
Jennifer. Thanks a lot.